Imagine sitting in a sterile tribunal room, watching your own flesh and blood smile as he tries to strip away your entire career, your reputation, and your sanity. That's exactly where I found myself, facing a panel of stone-faced board members, while my brother spun a web of absolute lies, claiming I had faked my structural engineering credentials for over a decade. He told a room full of strangers that every public building I had ever retrofitted was a safety hazard, calling me a fraud in a high-vis jacket who had slipped through the regulatory cracks. I sat there in total silence, hands folded, listening to him try to bury me with the kind of smug arrogance only a spoiled golden child possesses when they think the trap is already sprung. Behind him sat my parents, dressed like they were attending a tragedy, nodding along as if mourning a disgraced daughter instead of actively participating in her destruction. But then the tribunal chair reached for the primary evidence folder. She opened it without expression, scrolled past the first few pages, and suddenly went completely rigid. I watched the color drain from her face in real time. Her fingers tightened around the tablet, her eyes snapped up to meet mine, and in that single frozen breath, I knew she recognized exactly what my brother had done. The chair stood up abruptly, clutched the device to her chest, and retreated into her private chambers without uttering a single word. The entire room went dead silent. My brother's confident smile twitched. My mother stopped breathing, and my father looked utterly blindsided. In that moment of sharp, cold certainty, I knew someone's life was about to be completely dismantled. It just wasn't going to be mine. Before I reveal exactly what was hidden inside that digital file and why my brother ended up begging for mercy before the night was over, do me a favor, drop a comment telling me what time it is, where you are, where you're watching from, and what the weather is like. I always love seeing just how far these stories travel. To understand why my brother was so desperate to erase my existence, you have to understand the family dynamics we grew up in. The Mercer family didn't know how to love anything unless it could be photographed, cataloged, and envied by high society. My father was a renowned neurosurgeon who built a legacy operating on billionaires, and my mother treated charity galas like her personal Broadway stage. My older brother, Julian Mercer, was the crown jewel they had been meticulously polishing since birth. He had the perfect Ivy League pedigree, the flawless corporate handshake, and the exact brand of ruthless ambition my parents adored. He realized early on that in our household, validation was a transaction based entirely on how well you served the family image. I, on the other hand, never fit the script. I was the child who pointed out the cracks in the foundation, the daughter who despised rehearsed etiquette and elite facades. Because I was highly intelligent, they couldn't just write me off as a failure, so they labeled me as volatile and difficult. When Julian and I completed our respective postgraduate degrees, the divide between us became an unforgivable sin. He joined a massive corporate architectural firm in Chicago, designing glass skyscrapers for mega corporations who wanted their pasts wiped clean. I chose to specialize in public infrastructure restoration and low-income housing safety because I had spent my entire youth watching money dictate who gets a safe roof over their head and who gets crushed by neglect. At first, my parents treated my independent practice like a cute, temporary phase of youthful rebellion. Then, I won a massive municipal contract to overhaul the city's aging transit hubs. I made the mistake of sharing the news during a formal family dinner. I still vividly remember the heavy crystal glassware, the oppressive glare of the dining room chandelier, and the way Julian leaned back with his scotch like a monarch listening to a peasant. I told them how my team had exposed severe structural negligence in a city project, saving taxpayers millions and protecting thousands of daily commuters. I was still riding the wave of adrenaline, naive enough to think they would care about human safety. My father didn't congratulate me. He simply asked if I planned to spend my life digging through the city's sewers. My mother sighed, complaining about what she was supposed to tell her friends at the country club when they asked about my unglamorous projects. Julian just smiled mockingly, telling me I had confused charity work with real engineering expertise, claiming any mid-level professional could make more in an afternoon than I did in a year defending the city's overlooked communities. I looked right at him and said that at least my clients didn't have to lie about who they were. That was the moment the room turned to ice. My father called me an ungrateful child. My mother accused me of dragging down the family name. And Julian looked at me with that polished, patient cruelty he always used when he wanted to cut deep, saying I chose the mud because I simply wasn't built for the penthouse. That sentence burned itself into my memory, not because I believed his words, but because it perfectly outlined the terms of my family's affection. We were only worthy of love if we acted as a perfect mirror for their vanity. I stood up and walked away from the table before the final course was served. My father threatened that if I walked out that door, I would be completely cut off from the Mercer legacy. I told him I'd rather build my own foundation than rent my soul from them, one performance at a time. I walked out into the rain with nothing but my purse, my engineering license, and a cold, focused anger. That night in the driveway, Julian shouted after me that I'd come crawling back for a handout within 12 months. I turned around and told him he better start praying I never had a professional reason to audit one of his projects. I meant it as a warning, but years later, it turned into an absolute prophecy. I built my firm, Mercer Structural Analytics, from the ground up, which meant I did it without their shortcuts. My first real office was a cramped, drafty room on the 4th floor of an old brick building, above a printing shop and a late-night diner in South Chicago. I deliberately put my own name on the door because I refused to let my family own my identity. The waiting area consisted of 2 mismatched chairs, a battered metal desk, and an old radiator that clanked relentlessly all winter. I survived on black coffee, blueprints, and the kind of fierce determination that people call reckless until you start succeeding. In those early years, my team took on the cases nobody else wanted to touch, investigating tenant complaints against slumlords, verifying structural integrity for immigrant-owned businesses, and exposing corner cutting by cheap developers. I completely stopped caring about luxury because every single week I saw how quickly the system crushed ordinary people who couldn't afford a high-priced corporate defense. I hired Marcus Vance first, a brilliant former city building inspector with an almost photographic memory for zoning codes and municipal loopholes. Then came Elena Cruz, a young engineer with a fierce intellect, tattooed arms, and zero tolerance for corporate double talk. The 3 of us ran the firm like a highly focused strike team, cross-checking every calculation, verifying every blueprint, and treating every piece of data like it was hiding a second story. That extreme meticulousness is how we survived, but it's also how we made powerful enemies. City developers absolutely hated inspectors who couldn't be bought, and corporate firms despised seeing my name headline independent safety audits. Whenever I exposed a sloppy, overfunded firm in a public hearing, Julian watched from his glass tower downtown. He never called, but he sent passive-aggressive little reminders instead. Articles about solo firm bankruptcies, industry newsletters about engineer liabilities, and horror stories of structural failures. There would be no text in the email, just the link, like he was constantly tapping on the glass of my life, waiting for it to shatter. Then came the assignment that changed our trajectory entirely. A community board director contacted my office regarding a massive, highly complex structural discrepancy involving a new multi-use development downtown, which was tied to an aggressive corporate acquisition by a prominent investment group. Major firms had refused to touch the audit because the developers were politically connected, deeply funded, and notorious for blacklisting anyone who crossed them. But when I began reviewing the initial blueprints and soil density logs, something looked entirely too clean. The data points were too perfectly aligned, the environmental impact reports were suspiciously pristine, and the digital safety certificates were flawlessly ordered. Real construction data is messy. Ground conditions fluctuate. This file looked completely manufactured, so I officially took the case. The investigative hearing was assigned to Tribunal Chair Evelyn Thorne, the most formidable and respected arbiter in the state regulatory system. Thorne was old school, incredibly exacting, and famously unswayed by corporate theatrics or expensive legal teams. She cared strictly about empirical facts and uncompromised safety standards. The first day we walked into her hearing room, she looked at my off-the-rack suit and our solo firm filing stamp with the standard skepticism reserved for people she assumed would waste her time. But by day 3, that skepticism completely evaporated. Marcus, Elena, and I had spent sleepless nights dismantling server access logs, physical core sample metadata, and original foundation layouts, proving that the certified safety inspector had been secretly on the payroll of the acquisition group, trying to force the development through. During cross-examination, I broke their lead independent engineer using a single, hidden concrete delivery log, an inconsistent timestamp, and a technical question he never saw coming. By the time closing statements arrived, the corporate defense was completely ruined. The development was halted for a mandatory rebuild. The media swarmed the tribunal steps, and though Chair Thorne said nothing from the bench, her bailiff handed me a folded note as the room cleared. It read, "Ms. Mercer, that was an extraordinary display of technical advocacy. Do not let the politics of this city blunt your edge." I kept that note locked in my desk drawer, not because I craved validation, but because for the first time in my professional life, someone at the top of the system saw exactly what I was capable of and respected it. Julian saw the media coverage, and so did my parents. I knew they watched my interview on the evening news and felt that familiar, bitter irritation. My success directly disrupted the family narrative that I was the broken, unstable child who couldn't survive without their safety net. It proved I hadn't just walked away from their wealthy inner circle. I had built an entirely different tier of power. What I didn't realize at the time was that while I was solidly laying the foundation of my own firm, Julian was quietly hollowed out from the inside. From the outside, his life looked entirely flawless. The multi-million-dollar downtown loft, the exclusive club memberships, the imported luxury vehicles, and the curated vacation photos he constantly posted to ensure he had an audience for his happiness. But inside his corporate architecture firm, Julian was facing a financial catastrophe that his charm could no longer cover up. He had heavily entangled himself in a fraudulent private real estate speculation scheme, pitching it to several of his firm's high net worth clients, and had been secretly moving funds out of client escrow accounts to cover his compounding losses when the market began to collapse. It started as pure arrogance and rapidly evolved into corporate embezzlement, one desperate transaction at a time. He genuinely believed he could balance the ledgers before anyone noticed. But then an institutional investor demanded an immediate, independent audit. Julian found himself staring directly at a forensic financial window that was about to completely vaporize his career. He desperately needed two things to survive: a high-profile public act of professional integrity to make himself completely untouchable to the board, and a massive new influx of high-fee project portfolios to plug the financial crater before the investigators reached his desk. My firm was the perfect target. By that point, Mercer Structural Analytics had grown significantly, and several of our active contracts involved high-value city-backed infrastructure projects that a massive corporate firm would love to absorb. Julian realized that if he could orchestrate a public scandal to permanently revoke my engineering license for misconduct, he could achieve a double victory. He would present himself as the noble, devastated brother who chose public safety over family loyalty, and then his firm would gracefully step in to assume control of my abandoned public contracts under the guise of stabilizing a family tragedy. It was incredibly sinister, perfectly calculated, and exactly the kind of corporate strategy he prided himself on. He went to my parents first because he understood their psychological weaknesses better than anyone. He didn't frame it to them as a personal attack. He pitched it as crisis management. He told them he had uncovered massive, horrifying discrepancies in my academic and licensing records. He told my mother about the deep social embarrassment that would completely destroy her standing if the state regulatory board exposed her daughter as a criminal fraud before the family could act proactively. He reminded my father of the irreversible damage to the Mercer medical legacy. Then he offered them a beautifully curated narrative that appealed directly to their vanity. They could play the role of the dignified, grieving parents who chose institutional honor over their own flesh and blood. My mother, who had spent a decade ignoring my existence, eagerly jumped at the chance to participate in my ruin because it made her look profoundly respectable on paper. My father, who always worshipped institutional status over actual truth, signed the affidavits because he simply couldn't conceive that his highly successful, golden child son would fabricate a plot with such surgical precision. Julian then set out to construct the fraudulent evidence file. He utilized a high-level IT contractor at his firm who had mounting gambling debts and was incredibly easy to manipulate with fear and cash. Together, they forged an old state licensing exam failure notification from a decade ago, systematically altered digital document headers, fabricated an email chain where I supposedly confessed to working on projects before receiving my official license, and manipulated an online registry archive printout to make my professional registration number appear to belong to a long-retired engineer. It wasn't completely flawless work, but Julian was entirely used to dealing with high society people who checked the luxury brand labels, not the actual seams of a document. He also brought in a close social associate of my mother, a woman who had known me since childhood and was more than thrilled to provide a signed statement describing me as emotionally volatile and unstable, if it meant she got to feel important to a high-stakes corporate family. The absolute worst part of his plan wasn't even the forged documentation. It was what he engineered to happen immediately following my downfall. An internal corporate email he later sent to his senior partner made his intentions completely clear. The moment my license was suspended by the tribunal, his firm would immediately contact my highest profile municipal clients, offer emergency transitional engineering services, and completely absorb my firm's active accounts. He wasn't just attempting to destroy my life. He was planning to harvest my professional corpse to save his own skin. And because cruelty in the Mercer family always required a highly personal twist of the blade, he weaponized an old secret. Years earlier, Julian had called me from a parking garage in a state of sheer panic after a disastrous personal investment nearly exposed his financial mismanagement to our father. I had quietly wired him a significant chunk of my own savings to keep him afloat, because a naive part of me still viewed him as my brother before I fully understood what he was. He took my life raft, used it to survive, and then used that exact financial transaction history to build a fabricated case that I was funneling money out of unrecorded accounts. When the official disciplinary summons arrived at my office on a bleak, gray Tuesday morning, complete with Julian's signature as the complainant and my parents' signed affidavits attached, I felt an intense coldness wash over me. It wasn't heartbreak. Heartbreak requires a baseline element of surprise. What I felt was the definitive, final snapping of a psychological thread that had already been stretched past its absolute limit. By noon, my firm's small conference room had transformed into an active war room. I read the entire document packet twice, the first time as a betrayed daughter and the second time strictly as a forensic engineer. The first pass cut deep, but the second pass sharpened my focus into an absolute weapon. My parents had signed sworn, notarized statements claiming they distinctly remembered my original exam failure notice arriving at their estate years ago, asserting they had been completely manipulated by my complex lies and had only recently found the moral courage to blow the whistle. Julian's formal complaint was beautifully written, self-righteous, and saturated with the tragic sorrow of a man auditioning for sainthood. On paper, the allegations were completely catastrophic: unauthorized practice of engineering, forged state licensure, fraud perpetrated against municipal bodies, and the deliberate endangerment of public safety. If the tribunal panel believed even half of these assertions long enough to issue an immediate interim suspension, every single one of my active infrastructure contracts would automatically terminate and implode before I ever had the legal chance to clear my name. I immediately retained the services of Helena Vance. In our professional community, Helena was the person you called when the walls were actively closing in. She specialized in high-level professional license defense, regulatory misconduct, and the kind of catastrophic institutional warfare that routinely ended weaker careers before lunch. She marched into my office wearing a tailored dark wool coat, read through the entire stack of allegations in absolute silence, set the papers down on the table, and said, "This isn't a professional grievance, Chloe. This is a highly calculated corporate execution attempt." Hearing her say those exact words provided more comfort than any empty platitudes ever could. It accurately defined the true scale of the battle we were fighting. We immediately went to work building our counteroffensive. I pulled my original physical admission documents directly from a secure bank safety deposit box. The authentic passing results, my official oath records, state licensing confirmations, and every single archived fee receipt since day one. Elena Cruz compared our authentic files against Julian's forged materials, line by line under a high-resolution scanner. Marcus Vance systematically traced the procedural filing history of the complaint and instantly caught a fatal error. The structural formatting and agency seal on the fake exam failure notice didn't match the state's official template from the specific year Julian claimed it was issued. Helena brought in a top-tier forensic document analyst and a renowned digital forensics expert named Eli Kane, who analyzed PDF data structures the way a specialized cardiologist reads a complex heart scan, quietly, clinically, and with absolute fatality when he located an anomaly. Within less than 48 hours, the structural integrity of Julian's elaborate lie began to violently tear apart. Eli discovered that the digital files submitted as core evidence were saved in an archive that contained a hidden document titled exactly new text document.txt, which laid out the original unedited templates before they ran the forgery software. Not only that, but the fake failure notice utilized a digital signature block from an agency administrator who had actually retired 2 full years before the date stamped on the letter. The specific font package embedded deep within the coding of the PDF file hadn't even been adopted for state use at the time of the alleged document creation. The official regulatory seal had been lifted directly from a modern, high-resolution online graphic archive, not a period-accurate physical metal stamp. The fabricated email evidence showed internal routing metadata that was entirely inconsistent with the mail servers my account actually utilized a decade ago. Most importantly, the underlying digital object records and IP addresses pointed directly back to a workstation logged into Julian's corporate firm network. We had more than enough evidence to completely shut down the inquiry. Helena looked across the table at me and asked if I wanted to submit our findings to the tribunal board immediately to secure a summary dismissal. That would have been the safest, cleanest option available. Instead, I looked right back at her and said no. I wanted Julian under oath. I wanted him completely, irrevocably committed to his fabrications on the official record, in a room where an ideological retreat would cost him his entire career, rather than just a shift in strategy. Helena stared at me for a long, silent moment, and then a slow, knowing smile spread across her face, because she understood exactly what I was doing. This was no longer about simple professional survival. This was about a complete and total demolition of his plot. Even so, there was one incredibly dark night, just 3 days before the scheduled tribunal hearing, when the sheer crushing weight of the situation caught up to me all at once. I sat entirely alone in my dark office long after Marcus and Elena had gone home for the night. The fraudulent failure notice sat on the left side of my desk, and the old encouraging note from Tribunal Chair Thorne sat on the right. Outside, a torrential downpour slammed against the glass windows, hard enough to sound like manic fingertips clawing to get inside. For 10 quiet minutes, I allowed my mind to inhabit the exact life Julian had meticulously designed for me. Stripped of my professional license, utterly discredited, watched by my former working-class clients with that heartbreaking, confused betrayal people display when an institution tells them their trust was a massive mistake. Then I unfolded Chair Thorne's old note and read that single line again. Do not let the politics of this city blunt your edge. I realized in that exact moment that my brother had fundamentally mistaken my historical silence for absolute weakness, because that was exactly how my family had always processed my compliance. They never understood that silence can be a form of intense discipline. Silence can be a precision weapon with the safety still engaged. The very next morning, I sent Marcus to the state's physical admissions archive with an emergency legal request for a certified historical licensing verification, pulled directly from the physical microfiche vault, completely bypassing the electronic database. I wanted an unbroken, undeniable chain of physical custody. I wanted deeply embossed state seals. I wanted the precise brand of empirical proof that no amount of corporate money or digital manipulation could erase. By that evening, the physical documents were locked in our possession. On the day immediately preceding the hearing, Helena and I finalized our binders, organized our evidence tabs, and mapped out our procedural motion timelines. We didn't rehearse a single dramatic speech or emotional outburst. We didn't need theatrics. We needed an unassailable sequence of facts. Julian would open the proceeding. We would completely reserve our opening remarks. He would lock himself into his narrative under oath. The chair would read our submissions. The lie would fracture. And then we would decide exactly how much ground to take. I went to sleep that night without a single tear, without an ounce of fear, and without a single molecule of family loyalty left inside my body. The tribunal hearing itself commenced exactly the way arrogant, entitled people like Julian always assume their victories will begin, with extreme, polished cruelty and absolute confidence. He stood confidently at the center lectern, wearing a bespoke navy suit, his voice perfectly modulated into a tone of deep, sorrowful regret, telling the panel that he had only come forward because the integrity of the engineering profession mattered infinitely more to him than his own blood. He described me to the board members as brilliant but deeply unstable, intensely ambitious but fundamentally dishonest. A woman who had systematically manufactured an entire professional identity out of sheer fraud. He submitted the forged state letter, the manipulated email printouts, the corrupted registry logs, and our parents signed affidavits as if he were gracefully laying flowers on a grave he genuinely regretted having to dig. My mother sat in the front row of the gallery, delicately dabbing at her dry eyes with a handkerchief, while my father completely refused to even look in my direction. Helena calmly stood up and officially reserved our opening statement, allowing Julian's narrative to hang completely unchallenged in the room. Tribunal Chair Thorne reached for the electronic evidence tablet, and then came the exact moment the entire room shifted. She opened the primary file, went completely pale, locked her eyes directly onto mine, and vanished into her back chambers with the device pressed tightly against her chest like an active explosive. 15 minutes later, she returned to the bench carrying two distinct items, my tribunal file and a heavy framed court document. She didn't even sit back down in her executive chair. Instead, she marched forward and placed the framed document directly at the center of the bench, facing the entire room. It was the official municipal safety sign-off from the massive transit hub project, signed and sealed in her own tribunal room months prior. She looked directly down at Julian and demanded to know if he recognized the signature on the authorization. Julian, visibly trying to maintain his composure, stammered that he did not. Chairthorne told the room that the document memorialized one of the most thorough, structurally sound engineering audits she had witnessed in her entire 20-year career, an audit delivered entirely by the exact woman Julian was currently accusing of failing her licensing exams. You could physically feel the entire room's oxygen vanish. Julian's face didn't completely fall apart immediately, but his composure began to visibly fray at the edges. He desperately tried to argue that technical competence could easily be simulated by a clever con artist, asserting that frauds often succeeded because people desperately wanted to believe them. Chairthorne cut him off mid-sentence with absolute finality, announcing to the record that she had used the brief recess to contact the director of the state's physical licensing archive directly, completely bypassing the electronic network to pull the physical vault records. She held up a certified, embossed historical document. My engineering license was fully valid, had been completely valid since the day it was issued, and had never possessed a single regulatory blemish. She then turned her attention to the forged exam failure letter, calmly pointing out to the panel that the administrator who had allegedly signed it had officially retired months before the date printed on the letterhead. She turned to the email exhibits, noting that preliminary system diagnostics already indicated a completely impossible routing history and modern metadata generation footprints. Julian still desperately tried to hold his ground, stammering that there must have been an administrative mistake and asserting that he had relied on the external investigative materials in absolute good faith. That was the exact moment Helena Vance stood up and formally requested leave to present our rebuttal evidence. Chairthorne immediately granted it. Tab by tab, document by document, Helena systematically dismantled Julian Mercer in public view. She presented the font release chronology, the digital object tag generation data, the specific machine identifiers, the high-resolution state seal pixel mismatch, and the physical chain of custody certification directly from the state microfiche vault. And then came the absolute killing blow, the recovery of the hidden data folder containing new text document.txt, alongside an internal corporate email recovered through an emergency data preservation order we had quietly filed the moment the complaint was initiated. In that email, Julian explicitly outlined a plan to his senior partner to absorb my firm's municipal contracts to plug the mounting financial deficit in his client escrow accounts before an upcoming federal audit took place. The gallery didn't gasp. The entire room froze into a state of absolute shock. There is a specific kind of silence that is infinitely more violent than shouting, and we were standing directly inside the center of it. Chairthorne read through the corporate email twice, very slowly, and then looked up at Julian with the kind of profound disgust that completely empties a man out. So this proceeding was never about public safety or professional ethics, Mr. Mercer, she said, her voice dripping with ice. This was an attempted corporate theft dressed up as family virtue. Julian began talking incredibly fast after that, his words stumbling over one another the way a liar's words always do when they feel the floor completely dissolving beneath their feet. He frantically blamed the external IT contractor. Then he blamed an administrative misunderstanding. And then, in an act of sheer desperation, he turned and blamed our parents. He shouted that they had constantly pushed him, that they wanted me completely gone from their social circles, and that they had demanded he take action before I embarrassed the Mercer name any further. My father actually stood up from his seat in the gallery, shouting that Julian was lying and asserting that he had trusted his son's independent investigation. My mother began crying in earnest now, not the elegant, controlled tears she used for social effect, but a look of sheer, ugly panic because she finally understood that her social reputation could not outpace forensic evidence. Chairthorne slammed her gavel down, commanding both of them to sit down immediately, telling them they were no longer participating as grieving witnesses, but were now being viewed as potential accomplices to a fraud. That was the exact moment Julian truly broke. He completely abandoned the lectern, stumbled blindly toward my defense table, and dropped directly to his knees right there on the hard floor of the hearing room. He grabbed the wooden edge of our counsel table with both hands, looking up at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a drowning man. "Chloe, please," he whispered, his voice cracking completely. "You know exactly how the industry works. If this goes to a criminal prosecutor, it destroys my entire life. I can fix this, I swear. I'll transfer the downtown loft to your name. I'll liquidate my personal investment accounts. I'll give you whatever you want. Just please tell your lawyer to stop this right now." I looked down at him from my chair and felt absolutely nothing close to rage. Rage would have been a warm, human emotion. What I felt was the cold, clinical satisfaction of watching empirical truth strip a predatory man down to his actual size. Behind him, my father took a slow step backward, as if trying to prevent the absolute disgrace of the scene from physically touching his tailored suit. My mother whimpered Julian's name, but when he spun around on his knees expecting some form of parental rescue, both of them deliberately looked away from him, staring at the floor. That was the specific blow I think he felt most deeply, not the judge's disgust, not the unassailable forensic data, and not the county sheriff's deputies who were currently entering the room at Chair Thorne's direct command. It was watching our parents instantly choose social distance over his survival, the exact microsecond he stopped looking salvageable to their reputation. Chair Thorne directed the deputies to take Julian into immediate custody, pending a formal referral to the state attorney for perjury, submission of fraudulent evidence, obstruction of a regulatory body, and severe financial crimes tied to the corporate escrow accounts. As the officers lifted him by his arms, Julian began begging again, his voice higher now, uglier, screaming that he was just desperate and that he never intended for the plan to go this far. Chair Thorne looked down from the bench and said, "Men like you always intend exactly as far as they believe they can get away with." She then officially dismissed all charges against me with prejudice, ordered the entire proceeding permanently sealed as to my professional record, and issued a formal apology on the record for the egregious abuse of the disciplinary process. I stood up, calmly organized my files, locked my briefcase, and politely asked the chair if I was officially excused because I had an active structural site inspection scheduled for the following morning. The corner of Chair Thorne's mouth twitched slightly, not quite forming a smile but reflecting an immense tear of professional respect. "You are fully excused, counselor," she said clearly. "Unlike the complainant, you have actual, legitimate work to do." What occurred after that hearing moved significantly slower than the initial explosion, but it was infinitely more permanent. Julian's architectural firm suspended him before the sun set that evening and officially terminated his partnership before the week was over. Once their internal forensic accountants began a deep dive review of his files, the escrow manipulation expanded from a single client account to several, revealing a systemic pattern of embezzlement that federal prosecutors could easily explain to a jury in plain, undeniable terms. Criminal indictments followed rapidly, followed immediately by state board discipline. He lost his engineering license, then the luxury loft, then his personal investments, and finally every single one of his high society friends who had always mistaken proximity to his wealth for actual loyalty. My parents were not arrested that day, but they were formally served, intensely interviewed by investigators, and publicly named in enough criminal filings to permanently ruin the polite, curated version of their lives forever. My mother's exclusive charity circles completely stopped returning her phone calls, and my father was forced to resign from 2 prestigious hospital boards before he could be publicly pushed out. Within 12 months, they quietly sold the historic family estate under the public excuse of downsizing, though absolutely every single person in their elite world knew exactly what had really happened behind closed doors. Julian sent me letters at first from his facility, reams of paper filled with frantic apologies, convoluted explanations, and handwritten pleas invoking our shared blood and deep regret. I never opened a single one of them. Helena Vance secured a formal restraining order against him after his third distinct attempt to contact my office through intermediary parties. The legal order wasn't fueled by emotion. It was clean, professional, and entirely final. Mercer Structural Analytics not only survived the calculated attack because we moved with absolute precision, but the firm grew exponentially sharper. Municipal and private clients began seeking out our services, not in spite of the public tribunal scandal, but precisely because of it. City judges and developers who had previously only known me by casual reputation now knew exactly how I handled immense psychological pressure when the threat wore my own last name. Marcus Vance framed the official dismissal order and hung it prominently in our primary conference room. Elena Cruz routinely jokes that it's our true family portrait. I still keep Chair Thorne's old note locked in my desk, but after that hearing, I placed something else right beside it, a certified copy of Julian's disciplinary disbarment against me, completely stamped and sealed. I don't keep it there because I require validation anymore. I keep it as a permanent empirical record of what survival looks like when it completely stops asking for permission to exist. A year later, I officially expanded the practice and launched a nonprofit legal and technical defense fund designed explicitly for young architects and engineers from working-class backgrounds who are quietly being squeezed out of the profession by institutional games, old money pedigree, and corporate wealth. I built it because I know exactly how many institutional gatekeepers routinely confuse systemic power with actual human worth. I also did it because I firmly believe that revenge, if executed correctly, should do significantly more than just punish the forces that tried to break you. It should build something infinitely stronger and entirely unassailable in the exact space that damage leaves behind. Sometimes people ask me if I feel an ounce of pity for Julian now that the dust has completely settled. The honest, unvarnished answer is no. I understand the psychological mechanics of why he did what he did better than I wish I did, but understanding is absolutely not the same thing as absolution. He was not a tragic, misunderstood man trapped by unfair circumstances. He was a deeply narcissistic individual who genuinely believed his comfort and his future mattered infinitely more than my entire existence. He made conscious, repeated choices based on that belief over and over again, until the law finally answered him in the only language he actually respects. As for my parents, I buried my relationship with them long before any formal court order made the physical distance official. Blood is not a holy covenant when the loyalty only ever flows in a single direction. Family is absolutely not the collection of people who claim ownership of your name while actively plotting to dismantle your life. Real family is the people who stand firmly beside the truth, when standing there costs them something real. By the time the final legal appeal deadlines lapsed and the smoke finally cleared, I completely stopped viewing that tribunal night as the moment my brother tried to end me. I started processing it as the night the collective lie of my family finally ended instead. They accused me of practicing law and engineering illegally because they never possessed the capacity to comprehend what my work actually meant to me in the first place. To them, a professional title was nothing more than status, social leverage, corporate access, and wearing the right school tie in the right boardroom. To me, it was always infinitely simpler than that. It was the cleanest, sharpest weapon I had ever held. And when the people who should have protected me attempted to turn it against my life, I simply used it better. So let me ask you this. If your own family tried to completely bury your life to protect their own reputations, would you ever find it in your heart to forgive them once the truth came out? Or would you do exactly what I did, walk out the door, lock it securely behind you, and let the official record speak entirely for itself? We truly appreciate your time and your incredible support. Everything detailed in this video is fictional and created entirely for storytelling, entertainment, and personal reflection. We hope this narrative serves as a powerful reminder that you are never under any moral obligation to fix people who continuously choose to cause you harm. Sometimes, the healthiest, most profound choice you can make for your own life is to completely stop carrying the weight of relationships that only bring you pain.